A widowed Korean mafia boss saw a black nanny nursing his baby. What he did next changed everything. Behind the steel gates and armed guards of the Demyung estate, death always lingered close. But tonight, it had crept into the nursery itself. 6-month-old June's cries had turned from desperate to weak, then to silence, the kind of silence that stops a heart. The Korean staff knew better than to enter the boss's private wing without permission. And Demyung himself was 3 floors below in his war room, negotiating a truce that would either save his empire or destroy it. In the servants' corridor, Diane Newberry pressed her trembling hands against the cold wall, her body still aching from a loss too fresh to name. She'd buried her own child only 3 months ago. That sound, that terrible, fading cry, pulled at something primal inside her, something that transcended fear, protocol, and survival instinct. When the crying stopped completely, Diane broke. She flew up the forbidden stairs, past the cameras she knew were watching, and burst through the nursery door. What she found made her blood turn to ice. June's lips were blue, his tiny body convulsing, an empty bottle beside him reeking of something bitter and wrong. Poisoned. With no time to call for help, no doctor who could arrive in time, and no antidote within reach, Diane did the only thing her body knew how to do. She scooped up the dying child, tore open her uniform, and pressed him to her chest. The milk that still came, unwanted, painful, a cruel reminder of everything she'd lost, might be the only thing that could flush the poison from his small body. She didn't think about the cameras. She didn't think about the rules. She didn't think about what a man like Demyung would do to someone who dared touch his son without permission. She only thought, not this baby. Not tonight. 3 floors below, Demyung's phone buzzed. His head of security's voice was tight with tension. "Boss, you need to see the nursery feed. Now." What Demyung saw on that monitor, a foreign woman, a stranger, holding his son in the most intimate act of care, ignited something darker than rage. In his world, such unauthorized intimacy could only mean one thing: betrayal. Before I show you the craziest part, hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're watching from. This is about to get wild. The fortress had no warmth. Diane learned that her first week inside the Demyung estate, where marble floors stretched cold and endless, where armed men stood at every corridor intersection, and where the staff moved like ghosts, silent, efficient, invisible. She'd taken the nanny position out of desperation, a foreign woman with expired visa options and a grief so heavy it had hollowed her out from the inside. Her agency promised good pay, a private room, and a widower who rarely came home. What they didn't mention was that the widower was Korea's most feared Jongdae, a man whose name made grown men lower their voices, whose organization controlled half the city's underground, and whose wife's portrait hung in the main hall like a shrine to all he'd lost. Demyung had loved once. Diane saw it in the way he never entered the nursery, never held his son for longer than a formal inspection, never allowed himself to look at June's face, so painfully identical to the dead woman's, for more than a few seconds. His grief had calcified into something harder than stone. It had become distance, control, an empire of walls. He buried himself in his work, in territory disputes and blood debts, in anything that kept him from feeling. The baby was fed, monitored, guarded, but never touched with love. June existed behind bulletproof glass, surrounded by security cameras and rotating staff who feared their employer too much to show the child any real tenderness. Diane watched it all with quiet horror. She'd lost her daughter to stillbirth 3 months ago, her body still producing milk for a child who would never drink it, her arms still aching for weight they'd never hold. Every time she heard June cry, sharp, desperate, unanswered, something inside her cracked a little more. But she followed the rules. She kept her distance. She only entered the nursery during her assigned shifts, and even then, she moved with the careful neutrality of someone who understood she was being watched. Until tonight, when she lifted the bottle from the warmer and caught the smell. It was wrong. Subtle, but wrong. A bitter chemical undertone beneath the formula's usual sweetness. Diane's hands went cold. She held the bottle up to the light, swirled it gently, and saw the faint cloudiness that didn't belong. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Someone had tampered with it. Someone inside this fortress, someone with access, someone who wanted the boss's son dead. June's next feeding was in 10 minutes. Diane's mind raced through impossible options. Alert security, but by the time they investigated, verified, decided on action, the baby would have already drunk the poison. Find Demyung, but he was in a meeting that no one dared interrupt, surrounded by men who would shoot her before she got close enough to explain. Call emergency services, and watch them get stopped at the gate by guards who answered only to their boss. Every scenario ended the same way, with June drinking from that bottle while adults wasted time on protocol. The baby's hungry cry shattered her paralysis. June was wailing now, his small fists punching the air, his face red with need. 6 months old and already conditioned to expect nothing, to cry alone in his sterile room until someone remembered he existed. But tonight his hunger had saved him. He was crying before the feeding, not after. Diane looked at the poison bottle in her hand, then at the baby, then down at herself, at the uniform that barely contained breasts still swollen with milk meant for a daughter who would never need it. Her body had betrayed her once, continuing to produce nourishment for a ghost. Maybe tonight, that cruel biology could save a life instead of mocking a loss. She didn't let herself think. Thinking meant remembering the cameras, the rules, the man 3 floors down who would interpret this act as something unforgivable. Thinking meant hesitation, and hesitation meant death. Diane dropped the bottle into the disposal chute and reached for June. The moment she lifted him from the crib, something ancient and primal took over. His weight in her arms, his warmth against her chest, the desperate way he rooted toward her. It all crashed through the careful walls she'd built around her grief. She sat in the nursery's rocking chair, unbuttoned her uniform with shaking hands, and guided his mouth to her breast. The pain was immediate and shocking. Her milk had been building for days, her body refusing to accept that it was no longer needed. But as June latched on and began to drink, the pain transformed into something else, a deep, aching rightness that made her throat tight with tears. This was what her body had been preparing for. Not her daughter, maybe, but this child. This moment. This act of pure, desperate salvation. She had no idea how long the poison would take to work, how much damage it had already done, whether her milk could actually flush toxins from his tiny system, or if she was simply comforting a dying baby in his final moments. All she knew was that the hospital was 40 minutes away, and June didn't have 40 minutes. Her body was the only medicine within reach. 3 floors below, in a war room thick with cigarette smoke and tension, Demyoung's phone vibrated against the mahogany table. He ignored it. The Viper's representative was making demands that required his complete focus. Every word a potential trap. Every concession a sign of weakness his rivals would exploit. The phone vibrated again. Then again. His head of security's face appeared on the screen with a message that froze his blood. Nursery. Now. Emergency. Demyoung was moving before conscious thought caught up, his men scrambling to follow as he tore through corridors toward the monitor room. The security chief pulled up the nursery feed without a word, and what Demyoung saw stopped him cold. A woman, the foreign nanny, the one he'd barely noticed, sat in his dead wife's rocking chair, holding his son, nursing him from her own body in an act so intimate it belonged to family, to blood, to bonds that couldn't be faked or bought. Or so he'd thought. In Demyoung's world, nothing was innocent. Intimacy was leverage. Access was assassination. An unauthorized contact with his son wasn't compassion. It was infiltration. Someone had sent her. They had to have sent her. #hook. A widowed Korean Mafia boss saw a black nanny nursing his baby. What he did next changed everything. Demyoung reached the nursery in 90 seconds, his security detail forming a wall behind him as he threw open the door. The scene before him was worse than the camera had shown. More intimate, more complete, more damning. The foreign woman didn't even flinch at his entrance. She simply looked up from his son with eyes that held something he couldn't immediately identify. Not fear. Not guilt. Something softer and infinitely more dangerous. Put him down. His voice came out dead calm. The tone his men knew meant violence was seconds away. Put my son down and step away from him. Now. Diane's arms tightened instinctively around June, and that single gesture confirmed every suspicion blazing through Demyoung's mind. She was holding his son hostage. This entire display, the nursing, the tenderness, the maternal performance, was theater. A play designed to create exactly this moment, where she had access, leverage, and his greatest weakness pressed against her heart. I said now. He took a step forward, and 3 armed men materialized at his shoulders, their weapons trained on the woman who still hadn't moved. He was poisoned. Diane's voice was steady despite the guns pointed at her head. The formula in the warmer, someone put something in it. I couldn't let him drink it. So you violated my son instead? Demyoung's words cracked like ice breaking. You think I'm a fool? That I don't recognize an operation when I see one. An operation? Diane stared at him, genuine confusion breaking through her careful calm. I'm trying to save his life. By gaining access to his body. By creating a bond that makes you indispensable. He moved closer, his fury controlled but absolute. Tell me who sent you. Was it the Yakuza? The Chinese? Or did the Viper think he could get to me through someone soft enough, foreign enough, that I wouldn't see the knife until it was already in my back? The accusation hit Diane like a physical blow. She looked down at June, still drowsy and warm in her arms, his tiny hand curled against her collarbone, and something inside her shattered. This man thought she was a threat. He saw his son nursing at her breast, an act so primal it transcended culture, language, every human barrier, and his first instinct was suspicion. I lost my daughter 3 months ago. Her voice broke on the words she'd never spoken aloud in this house. Stillborn at 38 weeks. My body still makes milk for a baby who never lived. When I heard June crying, when I smelled the poison, I didn't think about your rules or your code or whatever paranoid game you people play. I thought about a child dying because no one loved him enough to break protocol. Love. Demyoung's laugh was ugly, bitter. You use that word like it means something in this world. Like it's not just another weapon people use to destroy each other. Maybe in your world. Diane stood, still cradling June, meeting the Mafia boss's eyes with a defiance born of grief and exhaustion. But in mine, sometimes love is just love. Sometimes a baby is just a baby who needs someone to give a damn whether he lives or dies. In my world, Demyoung said softly, dangerously, unauthorized intimacy with my son is a death sentence. Your story is touching. Your performance is convincing. But I didn't survive this long by believing in coincidences or trusting strangers who cry about dead children while contaminating my bloodline. He gestured sharply to his men. Take June. Get him to the hospital. Full toxicology panel. And have the formula analyzed immediately. As the security chief carefully extracted the sleeping baby from Diane's arms, Demyoung turned his full attention to the woman who'd just destroyed any chance she had of survival in his world. Her honesty read as manipulation. Her grief looked like strategy. And the fact that his son had calmed completely in her embrace, had found peace with her that he'd never found with his own father, felt like the cruelest betrayal of all. You're done here, he said. And if I find any proof you're working for my enemies, you won't just be fired. You'll disappear. Diane buttoned her uniform with trembling hands, her eyes dry, her voice hollow. The formula was poisoned. Test it. And when you realize I'm telling the truth, I hope you remember this moment. The moment you looked at someone trying to save your son and saw an enemy instead. She walked past him toward the door, past the guards who watched her like she was a bomb about to detonate. Demyoung didn't stop her. He simply stood in his dead wife's nursery, staring at the rocking chair that still held the warmth of a stranger's body, and wondered why the thought of never seeing that woman again felt uncomfortably close to loss. June's next feeding was in 10 minutes. The estate descended into chaos by dawn. Word spread through the staff quarters like wildfire. The foreign nanny had violated the boss's son, had touched him without permission, had done something unspeakable in the nursery that required armed guards and immediate removal. No one knew the full story, but everyone knew enough to understand that Diane Newberry's time in the fortress was over. Demyoung stood in his office, surrounded by his inner circle, as the preliminary toxicology report came through. Traces of oleander extract in the formula, enough to kill a child June's size within hours. The hospital had pumped his stomach, flooded his system with activated charcoal and fluids, kept him overnight for observation. He would live. The doctor said if he'd ingested the full bottle, he would already be dead. So she was telling the truth, Min-jun, his head of security, said carefully. About the poison. Or she knew about it because she put it there herself. Demyoung's voice was granite. He refused to let relief crack through the armor of his suspicion. Creates the threat, provides the solution, makes herself indispensable. It's textbook infiltration. Boss, the cameras show she only discovered the formula 10 minutes before. Cameras can be fooled. Timestamps can be altered. Demyoung cut him off with a gesture sharp enough to draw blood. She stays gone. I want her out of the estate and out of Korea within 48 hours. Make it clear to her agency that if they ever send another foreign worker here, I'll burn their business to the ground. Min-jun bowed and retreated, leaving Demyoung alone with a truth he couldn't afford to acknowledge. That somewhere beneath the layers of protocol and paranoia, he knew the woman had been innocent. Knew it in the way she'd held June, in the rawness of her grief when she'd spoken about her daughter, in the fact that she'd walked away without begging or bargaining or trying to leverage the life she'd saved into mercy. But innocence didn't matter in his world. Perception did. Power did. And if his organization thought he'd gone soft, thought he'd spare someone who violated his sanctuary because of sentiment or gratitude, they would tear him apart from the inside. By noon, Diane was escorted to the front gate with nothing but the small bag she'd arrived with and 2 months' severance pay in cash. No explanation. No chance to say goodbye to June. No acknowledgement that she'd saved the child's life. Just armed guards and cold efficiency, the same treatment given to any security risk being neutralized. She stood outside the steel gates as they clanged shut behind her, staring at the fortress that had almost become something like a home, and felt the last piece of her heart turn to stone. Inside the estate, Ji-won Park watched from an upper window with satisfaction curling through her chest like smoke. She'd worked for the Demyung family for 8 years, had been here when the first Mrs. Demyung was alive, had harbored quiet hopes that one day the widowed boss might notice her devotion. Then the foreign woman arrived, younger, softer, with skin like midnight and eyes that drew attention without trying, and Ji-won's carefully cultivated position felt suddenly precarious. She'd been the one to spread the rumors, to whisper in the right ears that the black nanny had been acting suspicious for weeks, asking questions about the boss's schedule, about his enemies, about the estate's security systems. All lies, but lies wrapped in enough truth to sound credible. The intimacy in the nursery had simply provided the perfect catalyst. By the time Ji-won was done, every staff member believed Diane had been working for the Viper all along. That the poisoning was a false flag operation designed to gain Demyung's trust. That the boss had shown remarkable restraint by merely banishing her instead of having her killed. Good riddance, Ji-won murmured to her reflection in the window glass, already imagining herself in the nursery, already picturing the boss's eventual gratitude when he realized she'd helped expose a threat. Some people don't belong in our world. She didn't notice the shadow behind her, Min-jun, who'd heard every word and whose loyalty to truth ran deeper than his loyalty to gossip. He said nothing, simply filed the information away in the part of his mind reserved for problems that would need solving later. Because if the foreign woman had been innocent, and if Ji-won had poisoned the well of reputation with lies, then the boss had just made a terrible mistake. And in their world, mistakes came with body counts. Someone had sent her. They had to have sent her. Subscribe real quick, tell me where you're watching from, and get ready, because the next 5 seconds will shock you. June stopped eating on the 3rd day after Diane left. At first, the staff thought it was residual effects from the poisoning, nausea, sensitivity, a disrupted system finding its equilibrium. But as the hours stretched into days, as bottle after bottle was refused, as the baby turned his face away from every attempt at comfort, the doctors began using different words. Failure to thrive. Attachment disorder. Emotional separation trauma. Demyung stood in the hospital's private wing, staring down at his son through the observation window as nurses tried unsuccessfully to coax the infant to drink. June had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that made him look like a ghost of himself. The feeding tube threaded through his tiny nose was the only thing keeping him alive, and even that was a temporary solution to a problem no one seemed able to fix. He's grieving, the pediatric psychologist said, her voice professionally gentle but her words brutal. 6-month-old infants are capable of forming profound attachments. When those bonds are severed suddenly, especially after trauma, they can shut down completely. It's not conscious. He's not choosing to refuse food. His body simply doesn't remember how to want to live. Then make him remember. Demyung's voice was hollow. He'd negotiated with warlords and faced down assassination attempts without flinching. But watching his son fade into nothing was breaking something inside him that even his wife's death hadn't touched. You're doctors. Fix him. We can keep him alive with tubes and intervention, but we can't make him bond again. That requires the presence of whoever he formed the attachment with. She paused, consulting her notes. His chart says there was a nanny, someone who provided care during the poisoning incident. Demyung's silence was answer enough. The psychologist's expression shifted from clinical to carefully neutral, the look of someone who'd just realized they were standing in a minefield. I see. Well, without that person, the prognosis is guarded. Some children recover with time and patience. Others simply don't. After she left, Demyung remained at the window, watching his son lie motionless in the hospital crib. June's eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing, waiting for something that would never come. For someone who would never come. The empire Demyung had built meant nothing here. His reputation couldn't buy a baby's will to live. His connections couldn't force an infant to eat. His money had purchased the finest medical care in Asia, and still his son was slipping away, one silent refusal at a time. He'd thought keeping June at arm's length would protect him. That distance would make him less of a target, that emotional detachment would keep him safe in a world where love was leverage and weakness was death. But he'd been wrong. The real danger hadn't come from enemies. It had come from his own inability to recognize salvation when it was offered freely, without agenda, without calculation. Diane Newberry's face haunted him. The way she'd looked at June, not with the careful professional distance the other staff maintained, but with the fierce, protective tenderness of someone who understood what it meant to lose everything. She'd held his son like he mattered, like his life was worth breaking rules for, worth risking everything for. And Demyung had thrown her away like she was nothing. His phone buzzed with messages from his lieutenants, territory disputes, supply issues, rivals testing his distraction for weakness. The empire demanded his attention. Business couldn't stop because his personal life was falling apart. But for the first time in his career, Demyung let the messages go unanswered. What good was an empire if he couldn't save his own son? What was the point of all this power if it was useless against a baby's broken heart? Minjun appeared at his shoulder, his expression grim. "Boss, we need to talk about the nanny. I've been reviewing the security footage and the staff interviews. There's something you need to know about Ji-won Park and the rumors she's been spreading." Demyung didn't turn from the window, but his voice cut through the sterile hospital air like a blade. "Tell me everything." Because if his son was dying from the loss of an innocent woman, if Demyung's paranoia had cost June the only person who'd ever truly cared about him, then someone was going to pay for it, starting with himself. She walked past him toward the door, past the guards who watched her like she was a bomb about to detonate. Demyung didn't stop her. He simply stood in his dead wife's nursery, staring at the rocking chair that still held the warmth of a stranger's body, and wondered why the thought of never seeing that woman again felt uncomfortably close to loss. The evidence came in pieces, each one a nail in Demyung's coffin of regret. Minjun laid them out on the hospital conference table like autopsy findings, security footage, financial records, intercepted communications, and finally, a confession extracted with methods Demyung didn't ask about and didn't need to know. Ji-won Park had been on the Viper's payroll for 6 months. Small amounts at first, just enough to report on household routines, staff schedules, the boss's movements. Then larger sums as her access increased, as her value as an asset became clear. The poisoning had been her idea, a way to prove her worth to her new employer while eliminating a rival she'd grown to hate with irrational intensity. She prepared the formula herself that night, Minjun said, his voice flat with controlled fury. Added the oleander extract during her shift, then swapped it into the warmer rotation. She claims she didn't know the foreign nanny would discover it in time. Says she thought the baby would drink it during the boss's meeting, that by the time anyone noticed, it would be too late to trace. Demyung stared at the photographs of Ji-won in handcuffs, her face swollen from interrogation, and felt nothing. No rage, no satisfaction, no vindication. Just a hollow ache that spread through his chest like poison. And the rumors about Diane Newberry? His voice was barely audible. All fabricated. Ji-won admitted to everything. The whispers about suspicious behavior, the invented questions about security, the suggestion that the nanny was working for enemies. She wanted the woman gone. Minjun paused, his jaw tight. The foreign nanny had no connection to any rival organization. No history of criminal activity. No agenda beyond the job she was hired to do. The next document Minjun produced was time-stamped footage from the nursery, enhanced and analyzed by their best tech specialists. It showed Diane's face the moment she discovered the poison formula. Genuine shock, immediate fear, frantic decision-making. Then the footage from the rocking chair, her expression as she nursed June, not one of calculation or strategy, but of desperate maternal instinct and barely contained grief. Our analysts confirm her micro-expressions are consistent with authentic emotion, Minjun continued. No deception markers. No signs of performance. She believed the baby was in immediate danger and acted accordingly. He met his boss's eyes. She saved June's life, and we threw her away based on lies. Demyung stood abruptly, his chair clattering backward. He walked to the window overlooking the hospital parking lot, his reflection in the glass showing a man he barely recognized. Haunted, hollowed out, stripped of the certainty that had always been his armor. The Viper's real target was never June, he said slowly, piecing together a strategy he should have seen from the beginning. It was me. Kill my son or turn me against someone innocent. Either outcome destroys me from the inside. Either I lose the child or I become the kind of man who punishes salvation. You couldn't have known. I should have known. Demyoung's fist slammed against the window, the glass shuddering but holding. I built my reputation on reading people, on seeing through deception. But I was so convinced that intimacy meant betrayal, so certain that no one could care about June without an agenda, that I looked at the one genuine thing in that fortress and saw only threat. He turned back to Min-jun, his face a mask of barely controlled devastation. Diane told me her daughter was stillborn, that her body still produced milk for a baby who died. And I called her a liar. I accused her of weaponizing grief while she was living through it. The truth was a mirror, and it showed Demyoung exactly what he'd become. A man so consumed by his code, so poisoned by paranoia, that he'd destroyed the only light his son had ever known. Diane's forbidden touch hadn't been an infiltration. It had been the purest act of love his world had seen in years. And he'd repaid her with exile and accusation. Find her, Demyoung said, his voice raw. I don't care what it costs or how long it takes. Find Diane Newberry and bring her back. Boss, she was deported 3 days ago. Her visa. Then find her in America. Find her wherever she went. He met Min-jun's eyes with something close to desperation. My son is dying because I threw away the only person who could save him. So you find her, and you tell her the truth, and you beg her to come back if that's what it takes. Min-jun nodded and left, leaving Demyoung alone with his reflection and the weight of what his pride had cost. And in their world, mistakes came with body counts. Min-jun's men found her in 48 hours, but it felt like 48 years. Every hour June spent connected to machines, every refused bottle, every moment his son's eyes remained empty and unfocused, carved another piece out of Demyoung's carefully constructed armor. The doctor spoke in increasingly grave tones about long-term damage, about windows of opportunity closing, about the permanent psychological scars forming in an infant who'd learned that love could be ripped away without warning. Diane hadn't made it to America. Her deportation had been rushed, her paperwork incomplete, and she'd been dumped across the border with nothing but her small bag and the cash severance that had been stolen within hours. Min-jun's contacts found her in a shelter on the outskirts of Seoul's dangerous Guro district, the kind of place where foreign women without papers disappeared into trafficking networks or worse. Demyoung went himself. His security detail protested. The Viper's people controlled half of Guro, and the boss walking into enemy territory was suicide wrapped in stupidity. But he didn't care. He'd spent his entire life behind walls and guards, letting other people take risks while he remained untouchable. That distance had cost him everything that mattered. The shelter was a converted warehouse that smelled of mildew and desperation. Demyoung walked through the narrow corridors past hollow-eyed women and feral children, his expensive suit and visible tattoos marking him as everything this place feared and hated. But he kept walking until he found her. Diane sat on a cot in the corner, wrapped in a thin blanket, her face gaunt and her eyes fever-bright. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her skin ashen, her breathing shallow. Someone had hit her. A purple bruise bloomed along her jaw. She looked up when his shadow fell across her, and the lack of surprise in her expression broke something in his chest. Come to finish the job? Her voice was hoarse, empty of fight. Or just checking to make sure the threat is properly neutralized. Demyoung knelt on the filthy concrete floor, bringing himself below her eye level, making himself small in a way no one in his organization had ever seen. The king of Seoul's underworld, on his knees in a shelter, in enemy territory, without his armor or his pride. I was wrong. The words tasted like blood. About everything. The poison was planted by someone on my staff, someone working for my enemies. Ji-won Park. She tried to kill June and frame you for it. You saved my son's life, and his voice fractured. I threw you away like garbage because I couldn't recognize love when it was offered freely. Diane stared at him, her expression unreadable. Your son. How is he? Dying. The word came out raw. Not from poison. From losing you. He won't eat, won't respond to anyone. The doctors call it attachment trauma. He bonded with you in that nursery, and when you disappeared, he stopped wanting to live. Demyoung's hands clenched into fists against his thighs. I came to beg you to save him again. Not because I deserve your help, I don't. Not because I can pay you enough, I can't. But because June deserves better than a father who was too broken to see that someone actually cared about him. You accused me of using my dead daughter as a cover story. Diane's voice was flat, but tears tracked down her cheeks. You looked at me nursing your son and saw a spy instead of a mother. I know. Demyoung bowed his head, his forehead nearly touching the ground. I know what I did. I know what I am. But June is 6 months old, and he's innocent, and he's fading because I was too proud and too paranoid to trust the one good thing that walked into our lives. He looked up, meeting her eyes. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to save my son one more time, even though his father doesn't deserve mercy. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had been broken and couldn't be repaired. Outside, sirens wailed through the Giro streets. Inside, a man who'd never begged for anything in his life waited for judgment from a woman he'd destroyed. Finally, Diane stood on shaking legs, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Take me to him, she said quietly. Not for you. Never for you. But June didn't choose his father, and he shouldn't have to die for your mistakes. Demyoung rose, and for the first time in a decade, he felt something other than the cold certainty of power. He felt gratitude, crushing and absolute, for a mercy he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. Because if his son was dying from the loss of an innocent woman, if Demyoung's paranoia had cost June the only person who'd ever truly cared about him, then someone was going to pay for it. Starting with himself. Before I show you the craziest part, hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're watching from. This is about to get wild. The hospital staff tried to stop them at the entrance. Demyoung covered in filth from the shelter, Diane wrapped in a refugee's blanket, both of them looking like they'd walked through hell to get there. But one look at the boss's face sent everyone scattering, clearing a path to the private wing where June lay dying by degrees. Diane stopped at the observation window, her hand pressed against the glass as she stared at the small body connected to tubes and monitors. June had deteriorated even in the 48 hours since she'd been deported. His eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow, his skin the color of old paper. The nurses had stopped trying to wake him for feedings. They were just keeping him comfortable while they waited for the inevitable. Let me clean up first, Diane whispered. He shouldn't see me like this. But when she opened the door to June's room, the baby's eyes flickered open. Some primal instinct, some recognition deeper than consciousness, made him turn his head toward her voice. For the first time in 6 days, June made a sound. Not a cry, but a small, desperate noise that broke everyone in the room. Diane crossed to the crib in 3 steps, her blanket falling away, and lifted June with hands that shook with fever and exhaustion and relief. The baby's fingers immediately tangled in her hair, his face pressing against her neck, his whole body curling into her like he was trying to crawl back inside the safety she represented. I've got you, she murmured, her tears falling into his dark hair. I'm here. I'm sorry I left. I'm so sorry. Demyoung stood in the doorway watching his son come back to life. It wasn't dramatic or instantaneous, but it was undeniable. June's breathing deepened. His color improved. The tension that had held his small body rigid for days began to ease as Diane carried him to the rocking chair and settled in with the practiced grace of someone who understood exactly what this child needed. She didn't ask permission. She simply unbuttoned the donated shirt someone had given her at the shelter and guided June to her breast. The baby latched on immediately, drinking with a desperation that made the attending nurse gasp. After 6 days of refusing all nourishment, June was feeding like he'd been starving. And perhaps he had been, just not for food. This is what power looks like, Demyoung said quietly, speaking to no one and everyone. 3 months later, the fortress had transformed in ways that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with atmosphere. Diane noticed it first in the small things. Staff members who smiled when June laughed, guards who softened their expressions when the baby reached for them. The way sunlight seemed to penetrate rooms that had felt tomb-like before. The estate was still protected, still dangerous to outsiders, still commanded by a man whose reputation made rivals think twice. But inside those steel gates, something miraculous had taken root. Love had made the fortress a home. Diane moved through the nursery with June on her hip, singing softly in a language the baby didn't understand, but responded to anyway. He was thriving now, chubby-cheeked and bright-eyed, reaching developmental milestones the doctors had worried he'd never achieve. The feeding tube was a memory. The hospital visits had stopped. In their place was a child who laughed easily, who trusted completely, who had two parents instead of just a terrified nanny and an absent father. Because Demyung had become a father in every sense that mattered. He'd restructured his entire schedule around June's routines, conducting morning meetings while holding his son, reviewing territory reports during afternoon feedings, teaching the baby to grip his tattooed fingers with a gentleness that would have shocked his enemies. The man who'd once avoided the nursery now spent every spare moment there, learning from Diane how to soothe and play and simply be present. And somewhere in those quiet hours of shared parenting, of midnight feedings and whispered conversations over a sleeping infant, something else had grown between them. Something neither had been looking for, something neither fully trusted, but something undeniable nonetheless. Demyung found her one evening in the garden, watching June explore grass for the first time with the concentrated wonder only babies possess. The sunset painted everything gold, and for a moment, Demyung allowed himself to simply observe this woman who'd saved his son twice. Once from poison, once from grief, and had somehow saved him in the process. "Diane." His voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "There's something I need to ask you." She looked up, and the wariness in her eyes made his chest tight. She still expected rejection, still carried the scars of that night when he'd called her salvation a threat. He couldn't blame her. Some wounds took longer than 3 months to heal. He knelt on the grass beside her, ignoring the mud on his expensive suit, and pulled a small box from his pocket. Not the ostentatious display a man of his wealth could afford, but a simple platinum band with a single stone that caught the fading light. "I'm not asking you to forget what I did," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to pretend I didn't destroy your trust when you offered me grace. But I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life proving that I learned from it. That I understand now what matters. That I know the difference between power and strength, between control and protection." Diane's breath caught. June, sensing the shift in energy, crawled toward his father with gleeful determination. "You saved my son from poison," Demyung continued, his voice rough with emotion he'd spent a decade suppressing. "You saved him from grief. But more than that, you saved me from becoming a man so hollow that power was the only thing left inside him. You showed me that vulnerability isn't weakness, that love isn't leverage, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is care when caring could destroy them." He opened the box, revealing the ring. "I'm not the boss asking his employee. I'm not the client making a contract. I'm just a man asking a woman who's seen him at his absolute worst if she'd be willing to see if there's something better underneath all that damage. Marry me. Not because June needs a mother, though he does. Not because I need help running this empire, though I do. But because when I imagine the rest of my life, you're in every single moment of it, and I can't bear the thought of you being anywhere else." Tears streamed down Diane's face, catching the last rays of sunset. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and Demyung felt the weight of every mistake he'd made pressing down on his chest like a physical force. Then June, with the perfect timing only children possess, grabbed the ring box with both hands and offered it to Diane with a babbled word that sounded suspiciously like "mama." Diane laughed through her tears, reaching for both the baby and the ring, and looked at Demyung with eyes that held 3 months of hard-won trust and the tentative promise of something more. "Yes," she whispered. "Not because I've forgotten. Not because it doesn't still hurt sometimes. But because I've seen you choose differently every single day since that night. I've watched you become the father June deserves and the man your wife would have wanted you to be. So yes, Demyung, I'll marry you. I'll build this new dynasty with you. I'll turn your fortress into a home." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook, then pulled her and June into an embrace that felt like redemption, like second chances, like everything he'd thought he'd lost when his wife died. The three of them sat in the garden as darkness fell, a family forged not through blood or tradition, but through sacrifice and choice and the stubborn belief that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Inside the fortress, the staff watched through windows and smiled. Their boss had found his way back from the edge. The foreign woman who'd once been cast out had become their lady. And the baby who'd nearly died from too many kinds of poison had become the heart that made the entire estate beat with something other than fear. The new dynasty had begun, not with violence or conquest, but with a man who'd learned to kneel, a woman who'd learned to trust again, and a child who'd taught them both that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is simply letting yourself be loved.